The dusty streets of Rhyolite, Nevada seemed to shimmer with heat and judgment as Preston Boyd watched the crowd gather outside the white clapboard church, their voices rising like a swarm of angry hornets demanding blood. It was late August in 1907, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the mining town that had sprung up seemingly overnight, transforming Sagebrush Desert into a bustling community of nearly 5,000 souls, most of them hard men seeking silver and gold in the unforgiving earth. Preston had ridden into town for supplies, his weathered hands gripping a list that included flour, coffee, and ammunition for the Winchester that hung on his saddle. He had not expected to find himself in the middle of what looked like an old-fashioned shaming, but curiosity and something deeper pulled him toward the commotion. The preacher, a tall man named Silas Whitmore with eyes that burned with righteous fury, stood on the church steps with his Bible held high above his head. His voice carried across the packed dirt street, condemning sin and wickedness with every breath. At his feet, looking small and defiant despite her obvious fear, stood a young woman with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like burnished copper. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and dried blood crusted the corner of her mouth, but she held her chin up as the townspeople hurled their accusations and insults. "This woman is a Jezebel," Preacher Whitmore thundered, his face flushed red beneath his black hat. "She has brought corruption and sin into our community. She has led good men astray with her wanton ways." Preston pushed through the crowd, his 6'2" frame parting the gathered masses like Moses at the Red Sea. He could not have said exactly why he felt compelled to intervene, only that something in the woman's green eyes called to a part of him he thought had died years ago when his wife Sarah had succumbed to fever, leaving him alone on his ranch 30 miles outside of town. What exactly has she done? Preston's voice cut through the preacher's tirade, calm and measured but with an edge that made several men step back. Preacher Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he regarded Preston. "She is a temptress who has been working at the saloon, leading men into debauchery and sin. She was found in a compromising position with Thomas Harrington, a married man, and has shown no remorse for her actions." The woman spoke then, her voice hoarse but steady. "Thomas Harrington tried to force himself on me when I refused his advances. I fought him off, and now he claims I seduced him to save his own reputation." A murmur ran through the crowd, but it was not sympathetic. Several women in their Sunday best looked at the accused with expressions of pure loathing, while the men seemed torn between lustful interest and moral outrage. "She lies." A heavy-set man pushed forward, his eye swelling purple where something had struck him. Thomas Harrington pointed an accusing finger at the woman. "She took my money and then cried assault when my conscience got the better of me." Preston studied both of them carefully. He had learned to read people during his years in the Nevada Territory, first as a deputy marshal before he had bought his ranch, and tried to build a quiet life away from violence and death. Harrington's eyes darted nervously, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the shade of the church overhang. The woman, by contrast, looked directly at Preston with a gaze that held both desperation and truth. "What is your name?" Preston asked her. "Grace Turner," she replied, "and I am telling the truth, though I know nobody here will believe me." Preston turned to face the preacher and the crowd. "Seems to me that if you are going to condemn someone, you ought to have more proof than the word of a man with a guilty conscience and a black eye." Miss Turner clearly defended herself against someone. "This is not your concern, Boyd," Preacher Whitmore said coldly. "You come into town maybe 4 times a year. You do not know what kind of woman she is, what she has been doing in that den of iniquity." "I know that Jesus said, 'Let he who is without sin cast the first stone,'" Preston replied. I also know that I see a lot of stones being readied here by people I have seen stumbling out of that same saloon on plenty of occasions." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Preston had a reputation as a fair man, someone who kept to himself, but who had never been known to lie or cheat. His words carried weight even if people did not want to hear them. "The wages of sin is death," the preacher intoned. "This woman must leave Rhyolite. She is not welcome here. If she remains, she will face the consequences of her wickedness." "Then she will come with me," Preston heard himself say, surprising himself as much as everyone else. "If you all are so determined to cast her out, I will take her to my ranch. She can work there, earn honest wages, and be away from your precious town." Grace Turner stared at him with wide eyes, clearly not expecting anyone to speak on her behalf, let alone offer her refuge. "Preacher," Whitmore's face grew even redder, but he could not argue against the solution without appearing unmerciful, which would undermine his moral authority. "Very well," the preacher said through gritted teeth, "but her sin will follow her, Boyd. You are making a grave mistake taking this woman into your home." "My home and my mistakes to make," Preston replied. He looked at Grace. "Get your things if you have anything to get. We are leaving." 20 minutes later, Preston and Grace rode out of Rhyolite together, she on a mare he had purchased from the livery stable because she had no horse of her own, and he on his gelding with supplies loaded on a pack mule. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the steady clip of hooves on hard, packed earth, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, punctuated by sagebrush and Joshua trees that thrust their twisted limbs toward the cloudless sky. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and hazy in the afternoon heat. It was beautiful in its desolation, and Preston had always found peace in the vast emptiness, but he wondered what Grace thought of it. Finally, she spoke. "Why did you help me?" Preston considered the question. "I do not rightly know," seemed like the right thing to do. Most men would have believed Thomas Harrington, or at least would not have cared enough to get involved. "I am not most men." Grace was quiet for another moment. "What he said was true about one thing. I was working at the saloon, not as a prostitute but serving drinks. I needed the money. My father died 6 months ago, and he left nothing but debts. I sold everything we had and came west thinking I could find work, maybe as a school teacher or a seamstress, but there were no positions available. The saloon was the only place that would hire me." "You do not owe me explanations," Preston said. "I feel like I do. You just took on a lot of trouble for a stranger. The least I can do is be honest with you." Preston glanced at her. In the clear light of the open desert, away from the angry crowd, he could see that Grace was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. Her face was oval-shaped with high cheekbones and a smattering of freckles across her nose. Despite the ordeal she had been through, there was strength in her features, a resilience that reminded him of the Joshua trees that survived in impossible conditions. "How old are you?" he asked. 23, and you?" 29. They rode on, and Preston found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. His ranch was small but successful, focused on raising horses rather than cattle. He had 200 acres with good water from a spring-fed creek, and enough grazing land to support about 40 horses at any given time. He broke and trained them himself, then sold them to ranchers and the occasional cavalry buyer. It was solitary work that suited his temperament, and he had not had another person living on his property since Sarah had died 4 years earlier. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when they reached the boundary of Preston's land, marked by a simple fence line and a wooden sign that read Boyd Ranch in weathered letters. Another hour brought them to the house itself, a modest structure built from timber and stone with a wide porch that faced west to catch the evening breeze. A barn stood 50 yards away, along with several corrals where horses nickered at their approach. "It is not much," Preston said as he dismounted, "but it is solid and the roof does not leak." Grace slid down from her mare, moving stiffly after the long ride. "It is more than I have had in a long time." Preston showed her inside, suddenly aware of how bare and masculine the space was. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs sat in the center, and shelves held dishes, canned goods, and cooking implements. 2 doors led to small bedrooms, one of which Preston had not entered since Sarah's death. "You can have the room on the left," he said. "I will bring in your things." Grace looked around, and to Preston's surprise her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what you have saved me from." Preston felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You will earn your keep. I need help around here. Cooking, cleaning, mending, garden work if you know how. I can pay you a small wage on top of room and board." "I will work hard," Grace promised. "I will not give you reason to regret helping me." That first night, they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Preston prepared, as Grace was clearly exhausted. He showed her how to work the pump at the kitchen sink and where to find linens for her bed. They spoke little, both tired from the day's events and uncertain how to navigate this strange new arrangement. After Grace retired to her room, Preston sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes called to each other in the distance, and insects chirped in the darkness. He thought about the risk he had taken, bringing a woman he did not know to his isolated ranch. The preacher's words echoed in his mind, warnings about sin and consequences, but Preston had long ago stopped putting much stock in Silas Whitmore's pronouncements. The man was more concerned with control than with actual Christianity, in Preston's opinion. No, what concerned Preston was not Grace's supposed sinfulness, but rather his own vulnerability. He had built walls around his heart after Sarah's death, had convinced himself that he was content with solitude and the company of horses. Now he had invited a beautiful young woman into his home, and already he could feel those walls beginning to crack. The next morning, Preston woke before dawn as was his habit and found Grace already in the kitchen, working at the stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. "I hope you do not mind," she said when she saw him. "I wanted to start earning my keep right away." "I do not mind at all," Preston replied, genuinely pleased. "It has been a long time since anyone cooked breakfast for me." They ate together as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Preston told Grace about the ranch, about his daily routines and what he would need from her. She listened carefully, asking intelligent questions and showing genuine interest in the work. "I should warn you," Preston said, "it gets lonely out here. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away. It will be different from town life." "I like quiet," Grace said, "and after yesterday I am not in any hurry to be around people again." Preston spent that day working with a young stallion he was breaking, while Grace threw herself into household tasks with an energy that surprised him. When he came in for the midday meal, the house was cleaner than it had been in years, with windows washed and floors swept. She had even found Sarah's old curtains packed away in a trunk and had hung them in the kitchen, brightening the space considerably. "You did not have to do all this," Preston said. "I wanted to," Grace replied. "Besides, it felt good to make a place feel like a home again." "I have not had that feeling in a long time." Over the next several weeks, they fell into a comfortable rhythm. Preston rose early to tend the horses, working through the morning while Grace managed the household. She proved to be an excellent cook, better than Preston had been even before grief had made him careless about meals. She mended his worn clothes, tended a small vegetable garden that had gone to seed, and even helped him with the horses when extra hands were needed. They talked while they worked, sharing stories of their pasts in small increments. Preston learned that Grace had grown up in St. Louis, the only child of a bookkeeper who had dreamed of Western adventure but had found only hardship. Her mother had died when Grace was 12, leaving her to care for her increasingly bitter father. She had taught herself to read from his books, had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but circumstances had never allowed it. In turn, Preston told her about his years as a lawman, about the violence and death he had witnessed that had eventually driven him to seek a quieter life. He spoke of Sarah, though it pained him, describing how they had met in Virginia City and married within 3 months, both of them young and full of hope. Her death from typhoid had nearly destroyed him, and only the demanding work of the ranch had kept him from drowning in grief. "Do you still love her?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Preston considered the question carefully. "I will always love her memory, but I have learned that grief changes over time. It becomes less sharp, more like an old scar that aches sometimes but does not control your life." Grace nodded, and Preston thought he saw understanding in her eyes that went beyond her years. As September turned to October, Preston became aware of a shift in his feelings toward Grace. It was nothing dramatic, just a gradual recognition that he looked forward to seeing her each morning, that her laughter brightened his days in ways he had not experienced in years. He found himself noticing small things about her. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the faint scar on her left hand from some childhood accident, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. He tried to push these feelings aside, reminding himself that Grace was his employee, that she was vulnerable and dependent on him, that acting on any attraction would be taking advantage of her situation. But the heart, he discovered, did not always listen to the head's reasonable arguments. Grace, for her part, seemed content with their arrangement. She never mentioned returning to Rhyolite or moving on to another town. She seemed to thrive in the isolation of the ranch, taking pride in her work and appearing genuinely happy for the first time since Preston had met her. In mid-October, a cold snap brought the first hint of winter to the high desert. Preston spent several days repairing fences and making sure the barn was secure against coming storms. Grace worked beside him when she could, handing him tools and helping to stretch wire, her hands protected by a pair of worn work gloves he had found for her. It was during this work that their hands touched accidentally, and Preston felt an electric current run through him at the contact. Grace must have felt something too because she pulled back quickly, her cheeks flushing pink. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Nothing to be sorry for," Preston replied, though his heart was racing. That night, Preston lay awake in his room, admitting to himself what he had been trying to deny for weeks. He was falling in love with Grace Turner. Maybe he had been from the moment he saw her standing defiant in front of that church, refusing to bow to the town's judgment. Maybe it had happened gradually over breakfasts shared in the quiet morning light and evenings spent talking about everything and nothing. The why did not matter. What mattered was figuring out what to do about it. November brought bitter cold and the first snow, light dustings that melted quickly, but promised heavier storms to come. Preston took a wagon to Goldfield, a larger town about 40 miles south, to stock up on supplies that would see them through winter. He invited Grace to come with him, thinking she might enjoy the chance to see new places and interact with people, but she declined. "I would rather stay here," she said, "if that is all right with you." "Of course," Preston said, though he wondered at her reluctance. Was she afraid of facing the same judgment she had received in Rhyolite? Or was there another reason she wanted to stay? He made the trip alone, completing his business quickly and returning within 3 days. When he arrived back at the ranch, Grace ran out to meet him, her face alight with relief. "I was worried," she admitted. "The wind has been terrible, and I thought maybe something had happened." The fact that she had worried about him warmed Preston more than it probably should have. "I am fine. Just took a bit longer because I wanted to get extra feed for the horses. Winter looks like it might be hard this year." They unloaded the wagon together, and when they were done, Grace surprised him by making a special dinner. Roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, followed by apple pie made from dried fruit she had been saving. They ate by lamplight, the wind howling outside but the house warm and cozy. "This is wonderful," Preston said. "What is the occasion?" Grace looked down at her plate. "I just wanted to do something nice for you. You have given me so much, and I wanted you to know how grateful I am." "Grace," Preston said gently, "you do not need to be grateful. You earn your keep and then some. You have made this house a home again. That is worth more than I can say." She looked up at him then, and Preston saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. It was not just gratitude. It was something deeper, more complicated, something that mirrored his own confused feelings. Before he could say anything more, a gust of wind rattled the windows and they both jumped, the moment broken. Grace rose to clear the dishes and Preston helped her, their conversation returning to safer topics like the weather and the horses. But that night, lying in bed, Preston knew something had changed. The question was whether he had the courage to act on it. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the ranch under 2 feet of snow. Preston and Grace worked together to keep the horses fed and watered, fighting their way through drifts to reach the barn and breaking ice on the water troughs multiple times a day. It was exhausting, dangerous work, and Preston was grateful for Grace's help, even as he worried about her safety in the brutal conditions. On the 3rd night of the storm, Grace slipped on ice while carrying water to the horses and fell hard, crying out in pain. Preston rushed to her side, helping her up and seeing that she had twisted her ankle badly. "I am fine," she insisted through gritted teeth, but when she tried to put weight on it, she nearly collapsed. Preston did not hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her back to the house, ignoring her protests. Once inside, he settled her in a chair by the fire and carefully removed her boot, examining her ankle. It was already swelling, turning an ugly purple color. "This needs to be wrapped and elevated," he said. "You are not walking on it for at least a few days." "But the chores," Grace began. "I will handle the chores. You are going to rest." For once, Grace did not argue. Preston fetched strips of cloth and wrapped her ankle with gentle competence, then made her a bed on the sofa near the fire where she could stay warm. He brought her water and pain powder, then went back out into the storm to finish the evening's work. When he returned, covered in snow and exhausted, he found that Grace had managed to make coffee despite her injury. She handed him a cup as he shed his outer layers. "You should not be up," he said, but he took the coffee gratefully. "I cannot just lie here doing nothing while you work yourself to death," Grace replied. "At least let me do small things." Preston sat in the chair across from her, warming his hands on the cup. The wind screamed outside, but inside the fire crackled warmly, and for a moment Preston felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said quietly. "Of course. Do you ever get lonely out here? Really, truly lonely?" Preston thought about lying, about saying he was fine, but he found he wanted to be honest with her. Yes, especially after Sarah died. There were days I thought the silence would drive me mad. That is why I started talking to the horses. Grace smiled at that. I talk to them too. They are better listeners than most people. What about you? Preston asked. Are you lonely here? Grace met his eyes, and Preston saw something vulnerable in her expression. Not anymore. Not since you brought me here. For the first time in years, I feel like I belong somewhere. Preston's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to say something, to tell her that he felt the same way, that she had brought life and light back into his existence, but the words caught in his throat. The moment passed, and they finished their coffee in comfortable silence before both retiring to their separate rooms. But Preston lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm and thinking about the woman in the next room who had somehow become essential to his happiness. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The sun emerged, blindingly bright against the white landscape, and Preston began the work of digging out. Grace's ankle was healing, but she still could not put much weight on it, so she stayed inside, watching from the window and feeling frustrated by her helplessness. A week later, on a clear, cold morning, Preston was working in the barn when he heard a horse approaching. He looked out to see a rider coming up the lane, and his stomach sank when he recognized Deputy Marshal James Corrigan, a man Preston had worked with during his lawman days. "Preston," James greeted him, dismounting. "Did not expect to find you in residence. Thought maybe you had holed up in town for the winter." "I stay here year-round," Preston replied. "What brings you out this way, James?" The deputy's expression grew serious. "I heard something interesting in Rhyolite last week. Preacher Whitmore is making noise about that woman you took in. Grace Turner, I believe her name is. He is saying you are harboring a criminal, that she stole money from Thomas Harrington." Preston felt anger rise in his chest. "That is a lie. Harrington attacked her and she defended herself. The only thing she is guilty of is surviving." "I figured it was something like that," James said. "You always were a good judge of character, but Whitmore is stirring up trouble, got some of the town convinced. I thought you should know in case he decides to take it further." "Let him try," Preston said grimly. "This is my land and Grace is under my protection." James studied him carefully. "You care about her, do not you? It is more than just charity." Preston hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I do." "Then you better make sure she is safe, because Whitmore is the kind of man who does not let go of a grudge. He sees her as a challenge to his authority, and men like that can be dangerous." After James left, Preston went inside to find Grace in the kitchen preparing lunch. She took one look at his face and set down the knife she had been using. "What is wrong?" she asked. Preston told her about the deputy's warning, watching her face go pale as he spoke. When he finished, Grace sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "I should leave," she whispered. "I have brought you nothing but trouble." "No," Preston said firmly, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "You are not going anywhere. This is your home now, and I will not let anyone take that away from you. But if they come here, if there is trouble because of me, then we will face it together," Preston interrupted. He took her hands in his, feeling their coldness. "Grace, I need you to understand something. You are not just an employee to me. You have become important in a way I did not expect and probably should not feel, but there it is. I will protect you with everything I have." Grace stared at him, her green eyes wide. "Preston, what are you saying?" He had not planned to do this, not now, not like this, but the words came anyway. "I am saying that I have feelings for you. Strong feelings. I know it might be inappropriate given our situation, and if you do not feel the same way, we can pretend I never said anything. But I needed you to know that you are safe here." not just because it is the right thing to do, but because I care about what happens to you." For a long moment, Grace was silent, and Preston braced himself for rejection. Then she squeezed his hands and a smile broke across her face. "I care about you too," she said softly. "I have for a while now, but I was afraid to say anything. I thought maybe you still loved your wife too much, or that you just saw me as someone you felt obligated to help." "Sarah will always be part of my past," Preston said, "but you are my present. And if you will have me, I would like you to be my future as well." Grace leaned forward, and Preston met her halfway, their lips touching in a gentle kiss that sent warmth flooding through him despite the winter cold. It was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, but then Grace's arms went around his neck, and Preston pulled her closer, the kiss deepening. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Preston rested his forehead against hers, hardly believing what had just happened. "We should probably take this slow," he murmured. "Figure out what we are to each other." "I know what you are to me," Grace said. "You are the man who saved me when everyone else condemned me. You are the man who gave me a home and treated me with respect when I had forgotten what that felt like. You are the man I have fallen in love with." Preston's heart felt like it might burst. "I love you too. God help me. I did not mean to, but I do." They spent the rest of that day talking, really talking about their feelings and their hopes for the future. It felt strange and wonderful to be opening his heart again after so long, and Preston found himself sharing things with Grace that he had never told anyone, not even Sarah. As winter deepened, Preston and Grace's relationship blossomed. They were careful about propriety, maintaining separate rooms and keeping their physical affection limited to kisses and holding hands, but the emotional intimacy between them grew daily. They worked side by side, cooked together, read aloud to each other in the evenings, and talked long into the night about everything from philosophy to the best way to train a stubborn horse. Preston had never been happier. Grace made him laugh in ways he had forgotten he could, challenged his thinking, and brought a lightness to his days that had been missing for years. She was smart and capable, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and a kindness that seemed to extend to every living thing. In late January, Preston made the trip to Goldfield again, this time with a specific purpose. He visited a jeweler and purchased a simple gold ring with a small emerald that reminded him of Grace's eyes. It cost him more than he could easily afford, but he did not care. He wanted Grace to have something beautiful, something that would tell her how much she meant to him. When he returned home, he found Grace in the kitchen making bread, her hands covered in flour. She looked up with such joy at his return that Preston almost proposed right then and there, but he held back, wanting to choose the perfect moment. That moment came a week later on a clear February afternoon. Preston had taken Grace out on horseback to see a frozen waterfall about a mile from the ranch. The ride was Grace's idea. Her ankle had healed completely, and she was eager to explore more of the land that had become her home. The waterfall was spectacular, a cascade of ice that glittered like diamonds in the sunlight. They stood together at its base, holding hands, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "It is beautiful," Grace whispered. "Not as beautiful as you," Preston replied, and before he could lose his nerve, he dropped to one knee in the snow. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Grace Turner," Preston said, pulling the ring from his pocket. "I know we have not known each other long, and maybe people will say we are rushing into this, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You have brought joy and purpose back into my existence. You have made me remember what it feels like to live instead of just survive. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Grace's face as she nodded emphatically. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. When they finally pulled apart, both were laughing and crying at once. "I love you," Grace said. "I cannot believe this is real." "It is real," Preston assured her. "You are mine and I am yours, and nothing is going to change that." They rode back to the ranch in high spirits, already making plans. They would get married as soon as possible, Preston decided. He did not want to wait, and there seemed no reason to. They could travel to Goldfield, where there was a justice of the peace who could perform the ceremony, avoiding Rhyolite and Preacher Whitmore entirely. But fate had other plans. 2 weeks later, on a cold March morning, Preston was working with a mare in the corral when he saw 3 riders approaching the ranch. His gut tightened when he recognized one of them as Preacher Whitmore, flanked by Thomas Harrington, and another man Preston did not know. "Grace, stay in the house," Preston called, and he saw her face appear briefly at the window before disappearing. Preston walked to meet the riders, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. He had not worn a gun regularly since leaving law enforcement, but James Corrigan's warning had made him cautious. "Preacher," Preston greeted them coldly. "You are on my land. State your business." Whitmore's face was hard as stone. "I am here to bring that sinful woman to justice. She has been charged with theft and immoral conduct. The law requires her to answer for her crimes." "What law?" Preston demanded. "Where is your warrant, your authority?" "The law of God," Whitmore thundered, "and the will of the good people of Rhyolite." "Then the good people of Rhyolite can go to hell," Preston said flatly. "Grace has committed no crime, and even if she had, you have no legal standing to take her anywhere." Thomas Harrington spoke up, his voice whining. "She stole $50 from me. I have witnesses who saw her take it." "You mean witnesses you paid to lie?" Preston shot back. "We all know what really happened, Harrington. You tried to force yourself on Grace, and when she fought you off, you decided to ruin her reputation to protect your own." The third man, a heavy-set individual with mean eyes, spoke for the first time. "Maybe we should just take her by force if this fellow will not cooperate." Preston's hand moved to his pistol, and suddenly his voice carried all the authority of his former profession. "I was a deputy marshal for 6 years, and I never missed a shot. You want to try taking her, you are going to have to go through me, and I promise you, at least 2 of you will not ride away from here." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "You would kill for a whore." "I would kill for my fiancée," Preston corrected, his voice deadly calm. "Grace Turner and I are to be married. She is under my protection, and if you do not get off my property right now, I will consider your presence a threat and act accordingly." For a long moment, the 3 men simply stared at him, clearly not having expected this turn of events. Then Whitmore spat on the ground. "You have sealed your fate, Boyd, both of you. Your souls will burn for this sin." "Maybe," Preston said, "but we will do it together. Now get off my land before I lose my patience." The 3 men turned their horses and rode away, Harrington glancing back nervously. Preston kept his hand on his pistol until they were out of sight, then turned to find Grace standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "About us being engaged." Preston crossed the distance between them and took her hands. "I meant it. I was going to wait until we could go to Goldfield to make it official, but yes, you are my fiancée if you still want to be." "More than anything," Grace said, and they held each other tightly, both understanding that they had just made an enemy who would not forget. Preston knew they could not stay isolated forever. Whitmore would continue to cause problems, and there was always the chance he might come back with more men or actual legal authority. The best defense was to make their union official and permanent as quickly as possible. The next day, Preston and Grace prepared to travel to Goldfield. They would marry there, far from Rhyolite's judgment, and then returned to the ranch as husband and wife. Once they were legally married, it would be much harder for anyone to cause trouble. They set out early on a clear morning, the weather finally starting to warm as spring approached. The trip would take 2 days, so they brought camping supplies and extra food. Preston kept his rifle within easy reach and his eyes on the horizon, watching for any sign of pursuit. They made good time, stopping at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. Grace seemed excited despite the circumstances, talking about their future together and the life they would build. "I want children someday," she said shyly. "Is that something you want?" Preston smiled. "I would love to have children with you. Sarah and I tried, but it never happened. I had started to think maybe I was not meant to be a father, but with you I want to try again." "How many?" Grace asked playfully. "As many as the good Lord sees fit to bless us with," Preston replied. "Though I should warn you, I have no idea how to be a father. I will probably make a mess of it." "Then we will make a mess of it together," Grace said, leaning against him. They camped that night under the stars, building a fire and cooking a simple meal. Preston laid out their bedrolls near the warmth of the fire, but at a respectful distance from each other. They talked late into the night, Grace's head resting on Preston's shoulder, his arm around her. "Are you scared?" she asked at one point. "Of what?" "Of everything changing. Of what people might say or do." Preston considered this. "I am scared of losing you. That is the only thing that frightens me. As for what people say, I stopped caring about that a long time ago. The people whose opinions matter will understand, and the ones who do not understand, well, their opinions do not matter." "I am scared I will disappoint you," Grace admitted quietly. "That you will realize I am not worth all this trouble." Preston turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Grace Turner, you listen to me. You are worth everything. You are smart and kind and brave, and you make me happier than I have been in years. Do not ever doubt your worth. Do you understand?" Grace nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and Preston kissed her gently, tasting salt from her tears. They arrived in Goldfield the following afternoon, a bustling mining town that made Rhyolite look small by comparison. Preston found them rooms at a modest hotel, insisting on separate accommodations until they were married, then went to find the justice of the peace. Judge Marcus Fleming was a portly man in his 50s with kind eyes and a ready smile. He listened to their story without judgment, then nodded. "I can marry you tomorrow morning if you like. I will need witnesses, but my clerk and his wife can stand in for that." "Will that suit you?" "That would be perfect," Preston said, relief flooding through him. They spent the rest of the day exploring Goldfield. Preston bought Grace a new dress for the wedding, a simple but elegant blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She protested the expense, but Preston insisted, wanting her to have something special for their wedding day. That evening they ate dinner at a restaurant, a rare treat after months of home cooking. Grace seemed to glow with happiness, and Preston could not stop looking at her, marveling at how his life had changed in just 6 months. "Thank you," Grace said as they walked back to the hotel. "For what?" "For everything. For saving me, for believing in me, for loving me. I know I have said it before, but I need you to know how much it means. You gave me back my life." "You gave me back mine," Preston replied. "I was just existing before you came along. Now I feel alive again." They stopped outside Grace's room and Preston kissed her goodnight, a long, lingering kiss that promised everything to come. "Tomorrow you will be my wife," he whispered against her lips. "Tomorrow cannot come soon enough," Grace whispered back. The wedding took place the next morning in Judge Fleming's office, a simple ceremony that was no less meaningful for its lack of pomp. Grace wore her new blue dress and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers Preston had purchased from a street vendor. Preston wore his best shirt and pants, his hair slicked back and his face freshly shaved. Judge Fleming read the words that bound them together, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Grace with all the love and promise he felt in his heart. The clerk and his wife clapped, and Grace laughed through happy tears. They signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and official. Preston felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Grace was his now, protected by law as well as by his love. Let Preacher Whitmore and Thomas Harrington try to cause trouble now. They spent their wedding night in the hotel, and for the first time, shared a room and a bed as husband and wife. Preston was gentle with Grace, mindful that she had been hurt by men before, but she responded to him with a passion that took his breath away. They made love slowly, learning each other's bodies, and afterward lay tangled together, talking softly until they fell asleep in each other's arms. The next morning, they began the journey back to the ranch, traveling as a married couple. Preston noticed that Grace seemed more relaxed, more confident, as if their marriage had given her a security she had lacked before. She smiled more, laughed more, and touched him freely, taking his hand or leaning against him as they rode. They arrived home in the late afternoon to find everything as they had left it. The horses nickered a greeting and Grace laughed, clearly happy to be back. "I never thought I would call any place home again," she said as they dismounted. "But this is home. This is where I belong." "This is where we both belong," Preston agreed, pulling her close. They spent the rest of the day settling back in, Grace preparing a celebratory meal while Preston tended to the horses. That night, they made love again in their bed, no longer separated by walls and propriety, and Preston thanked whatever forces had brought them together. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the desert landscape. Wildflowers bloomed in brilliant profusions of color, and the air warmed enough to make outdoor work pleasant instead of punishing. Preston and Grace worked together to prepare for the foaling season, repairing the barn and setting up special stalls for the pregnant mares. In May, Grace announced that she thought she might be pregnant. Preston was overjoyed, though also nervous about Grace's health after what had happened to Sarah. But Grace seemed strong and healthy, and when they made the trip to Goldfield to see a doctor, he confirmed the pregnancy and said everything looked normal. "The baby should arrive in January," the doctor said. "Make sure your wife gets plenty of rest and good food." Preston took this advice seriously, perhaps too seriously, as Grace laughingly told him when he tried to do all the work himself. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said. "I can still cook and clean and help with light work. I just want to make sure nothing happens to you," Preston said. "Nothing is going to happen to me," Grace assured him. "We are going to have a healthy baby and we are going to be a family." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Preston found himself falling even more deeply in love with his wife. She seemed to bloom along with the desert, her face glowing with health and happiness. They spent their evenings on the porch, Preston's hand resting on her growing belly, feeling their child kick and move. "What should we name him?" Grace asked one evening. "What makes you think it is a him? Just a feeling." "What about Thomas?" Preston made a face and Grace laughed. "Not after that Thomas, silly, after my father. Despite everything, he did his best to raise me after my mother died." "Thomas is a good name," Preston agreed. "And if it is a girl, Clara after your mother." Preston felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She would have loved you." "I wish I could have known her. I wish both our parents could see how happy we are." "Maybe they can," Preston said softly. "Maybe they are looking down right now and smiling." Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Preston continued his work with the horses, and Grace managed the household with increasing skill. They occasionally saw neighboring ranchers, and word spread that Preston Boyd had gotten married. Most people were happy for him, though a few raised eyebrows when they learned his bride was the woman the preacher had condemned. In September, Preston made his regular trip to Goldfield for supplies. He invited Grace to come along, but she was too far along in her pregnancy to make the journey comfortably. He went alone, promising to return within 3 days. While in Goldfield, Preston ran into Deputy Marshal Corrigan again. The lawman pulled him aside with a serious expression. "I thought you should know. Whitmore is still making noise about your wife. He has been writing letters to the territorial governor, claiming she is a criminal who should be arrested. So far, nothing has come of it, but the man is persistent." Preston felt anger rise in his chest. "The man is insane. Grace has done nothing wrong. I know that, and most reasonable people know that, but Whitmore has a following. Just be careful, Preston. Men like that do not give up easily." Preston returned home troubled, but the sight of Grace waiting for him on the porch, her hand on her swollen belly, pushed his worries aside. He would protect his family no matter what it took. In December, they prepared for the baby's arrival. Preston converted the second bedroom into a nursery, building a cradle from oak wood and sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Grace sewed blankets and clothes from fabric Preston had purchased, her face serene as she worked. On a cold January night, Grace woke Preston with news that her labor had begun. Preston tried not to panic as he helped her through the contractions, remembering everything the doctor had told them. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning, Grace bearing the pain with a strength that awed Preston. Finally, as the sun rose on a new day, their son was born, entering the world with a lusty cry that filled the house. Preston cut the cord with shaking hands, then wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and handed him to Grace. "He is perfect," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at their son. "He looks like you," Preston said, marveling at the tiny face, the small hands that gripped his finger with surprising strength. They named him Thomas Preston Boyd, and Preston felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. He had a family again, a real family, and the joy of it was almost overwhelming. Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting but wonderful. Preston helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried at night, changing diapers, and doing anything Grace needed so she could rest and recover. Watching Grace nurse their son, seeing the love in her eyes, Preston felt blessed beyond measure. Spring came again, and with it, new life on the ranch. Several mares foaled, and Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby baby who smiled and cooed at his parents. Preston taught himself to work one-handed, carrying Thomas in a sling while he did chores, talking to his son about horses and the land. Grace recovered her strength and threw herself back into the work of the household, though now with the added responsibility of caring for a baby. She seemed to take to motherhood naturally, and Preston often caught her singing to Thomas or playing with him, her face alight with joy. In May, they were surprised by a visit from Deputy Marshal Corrigan, and another man Preston did not recognize. His stomach sank, fearing bad news, but Corrigan's expression was neutral rather than hostile. "Preston, Grace, this is Territorial Marshal Daniel Wright. He is here about the accusations Preacher Whitmore has been making." Preston invited them inside, where Grace was nursing Thomas. She covered herself modestly with a shawl but did not leave, and Preston was proud of her courage. Marshal Wright was a tall, distinguished-looking man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He accepted a cup of coffee and studied them both carefully before speaking. "I have been investigating the claims made by Reverend Whitmore regarding Mrs. Boyd. I have interviewed numerous witnesses in Rhyolite and reviewed all available evidence. I wanted to come here personally to tell you that I have found no basis for any criminal charges. The accusations appear to be motivated by personal animosity rather than actual wrongdoing. Preston felt relief wash over him, but Wright was not finished. However, I also need to warn you that Whitmore is not giving up. He has been trying to get a circuit judge to issue some sort of order against your wife, claiming she is an immoral influence. So far, no judge has been willing to do so, but he may eventually find someone sympathetic to his cause. What can we do? Grace asked quietly. Live your lives, Wright said simply. Be good citizens, which from what I have seen and heard you already are. Eventually, Whitmore will move on to a new target or people will grow tired of his crusade. In the meantime, I will make sure word gets out that the Territorial Marshal's office has cleared you of any wrongdoing. After Wright and Corrigan left, Preston and Grace held each other tightly, Thomas between them. I am so tired of this, Grace whispered. Why cannot he just leave us alone? Because men like Whitmore need someone to condemn to feel righteous, Preston said. But we are not going to let him win. We have a good life here, and we are not going to hide or be ashamed. As if to underscore Preston's words, they decided to make a statement. In June, they loaded the wagon with some of Preston's best trained horses and made the trip not to Goldfield but to Rhyolite itself. It was time to face down the rumors and show the town that Grace Boyd was a respectable married woman with a family, not the fallen woman Whitmore claimed her to be. They arrived on a Saturday morning when the town was busy with weekend commerce. Preston helped Grace down from the wagon, Thomas in her arms, and they walked together down the main street. Preston noticed people staring, whispering, but he kept his head high and his hand protectively on Grace's back. They visited the general store, where Preston made several purchases. The shopkeeper, a pragmatic man named Henry Chen, treated them courteously, more interested in their money than any gossip. As they were leaving the store, they came face to face with Preacher Whitmore. The man's expression twisted with anger when he saw them. You dare show your face in this town? He spat at Grace. This is my wife you are addressing, Preston said coldly. I will thank you to speak respectfully or not at all. Wife, a mockery of the institution of marriage, that woman is what? Preston interrupted. A good mother, a faithful wife, a hard worker. Those are the only things Grace is, and if you continue to slander her, I will take legal action against you. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Preston saw faces he recognized, some sympathetic, others hostile, most simply curious. Thomas Harrington was there too, looking uncomfortable. His wife stood beside him, a thin woman with a sour expression. Tell them the truth, Harrington, Preston said loudly. Tell them what really happened with Grace, or I will. Harrington's face went red and his wife looked at him sharply. Thomas, what is he talking about? Preston saw his chance. Your husband attacked my wife when she was working at the saloon. When she fought him off, he claimed she stole from him to protect his own reputation. That is the truth of what happened. That is a lie. Harrington blustered, but his eyes were panicked. Is it? Preston pulled a paper from his pocket. This is a statement from the Territorial Marshal's office clearing my wife of all accusations. They investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of any crime. The only crime committed was yours, Harrington, and everyone here knows it. The crowd murmured, and Preston saw doubt spreading. Harrington's wife looked at her husband with suspicion, and Preston knew the seed had been planted. Over time, the truth would spread and Whitmore's crusade would lose its power. You have not won, Whitmore hissed. The righteous will prevail. Then I hope we all see you prevail someday, preacher, Preston said mildly. but leave my family alone. We have done nothing to you, and we are not going to let you poison our lives." They walked away, leaving Whitmore sputtering on the street. As they reached the wagon, several townspeople approached, including a woman Preston recognized as the schoolteacher. "Mrs. Boyd," she said gently to Grace, "I just wanted to say that I never believed those awful things. I hope you and your family will be happy." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." Several others offered similar sentiments, and Preston realized that not everyone had believed Whitmore's accusations. There were good people in Rhyolite after all, people who were willing to judge based on evidence rather than prejudice. As they drove out of town, Grace leaned against Preston, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms. "You think it is really over?" she asked. "I do not know," Preston admitted, "but I think we just won an important battle. People saw us as a family, saw that you are not what Whitmore claimed. That counts for something." Indeed, as the months passed, Preston and Grace heard less and less about Whitmore's campaign against them. Occasionally, Deputy Corrigan would pass along news that the preacher was still making noise, but without support from the community or the authorities, his words carried no weight. Life on the ranch continued its peaceful rhythm. Thomas grew into a toddler, walking and talking and getting into everything. Preston found fatherhood more rewarding than he had imagined, delighting in his son's discoveries and teaching him about horses and the land. Grace bloomed in her role as wife and mother. She had found a confidence and peace that made her even more beautiful than when Preston had first met her. They talked sometimes about those early days, marveling at how much had changed. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching Thomas play in the dirt. "Taking me in that day, all the trouble it caused," Preston pulled her close. "Not for 1 second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, you and Thomas both." In the fall of 1909, Grace announced she was pregnant again. This time, Preston was less anxious, having been through it once before. Their daughter was born the following May, a tiny girl with her mother's red hair and green eyes. They named her Clara Rose Boyd, and Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Preston now had everything he had thought lost to him: a wife he loved, children to carry on his name, a successful ranch, and peace. The ghosts of his past no longer haunted him. Sarah's memory remained, but it was gentle now, a reminder of love rather than a source of pain. In 1911, Preston decided to expand the ranch, purchasing an additional 100 acres from a neighboring rancher who was retiring. The work was hard but satisfying, and Grace worked beside him when she could. Thomas and Clara playing nearby under the watchful eye of a young woman from Goldfield they had hired to help with the children. One day in early summer, Preston looked up from the fence post he was setting to see Grace walking toward him across the field, Clara on her hip and Thomas running ahead. The sight filled him with such profound contentment that he had to stop and just watch them approach. "What are you smiling about?" Grace asked when she reached him. "Just thinking about how blessed I am," Preston replied, kissing her soundly and making Thomas giggle. "I have everything a man could want." "You are easy to please," Grace teased, but her eyes were soft. "I am pleased by the right things," Preston corrected. "Family, love, honest work, and a good woman by my side. What more could anyone need?" As the years passed, Preston and Grace's family grew to include another son, whom they named Daniel after the marshal who had helped clear Grace's name. The Boyd Ranch became known throughout Nevada for producing quality horses, and Preston's reputation as a fair and honest man spread. Thomas Harrington died in 1913, some said from drink, though others whispered it was from guilt. Preacher Whitmore left Rhyolite shortly after, moving to California where presumably he found new targets for his self-righteous fury. The town itself began to decline as the mines played out, but Preston and Grace were far enough away that it did not affect them. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1918, Preston took Grace back to Goldfield, leaving the children with their hired help for a few days. They stayed at the same hotel where they had spent their wedding night, ate at the same restaurant, and walked the same streets. "Do you remember how scared we both were?" Grace asked as they strolled arm in arm. "I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive," Preston replied. "I still think that, even with 3 children who never stop making noise, especially because of them. They are proof that good things can come from darkness, that love can triumph over hate." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. Even at 33, she was as beautiful to Preston as she had been at 23, maybe more so because of the life they had built together. "I love you, Preston Boyd," she said. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Thank you for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself. Thank you for giving me a home and a family and a life worth living." "You gave me all those things too," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved me just as much as I saved you, maybe more." They kissed there on the street in Goldfield, not caring who saw. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ruins of their pasts. 20 years after Preston first brought Grace to his ranch, they sat on that same porch watching the sunset, their children grown and starting families of their own. Thomas was working as a horse trainer in California. Clara had married a doctor and lived in Reno, and Daniel was running the ranch with his father, preparing to take it over completely when Preston retired. "We did well," Grace said softly, her hand in Preston's as it had been so many evenings before. "We did," Preston agreed, "better than I ever dreamed possible. Do you ever think about that day, when you saw me in front of the church? Sometimes. I think about how close I came to just riding past, minding my own business. What would have happened to you if I had?" "I do not know," Grace said. "Nothing good. You really did save my life that day." "And you saved mine," Preston said, squeezing her hand. "Every day since." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue as the first stars appeared. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, and the horses nickered softly in their corrals. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Preston thought about the journey that had brought them here, all the obstacles they had overcome, and the love that had sustained them through it all. He thought about the preacher who had condemned Grace, not knowing that, in doing so, he had pushed her toward her salvation. He thought about loneliness and second chances, about judgment and redemption. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked. "Just that I am grateful," Preston said, "for all of it, even the hard parts, because they brought us here." "Me too," Grace said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Me too." As darkness fell and the stars multiplied overhead, Preston and Grace Boyd sat together. 2 souls who had found each other in the wilderness and built a love that would last all their days. The preacher who had condemned Grace was long forgotten, but the blessing she had become to Preston endured, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and love to transform lives and create families from the ashes of despair. Their story would be told by their children and grandchildren, passed down through generations as an example of how one moment of kindness could change everything. How love could bloom even in the harsh desert, and how the greatest blessings often came disguised as the things society rejected. Preston Boyd had been a lonely rancher, and Grace Turner had been a woman condemned, but together they had become something neither could have achieved alone. They had become home to each other, And in that home, they had found peace, purpose, and a love that would echo through time long after they were gone. The years continued to pass gently. Preston watched his grandchildren play in the same dirt where their parents had played, teaching them about horses and integrity and treating people with dignity regardless of what anyone else said about them. Grace became the heart of their growing family, the grandmother everyone wanted to confide in, the woman who had wisdom born of suffering and compassion, born of having been shown mercy when she needed it most. On their 40th wedding anniversary, with children and grandchildren gathered around them, Preston stood to make a toast. His hair was white now, his face weathered by decades under the Nevada sun, but his eyes were bright as he looked at Grace. 40 years ago, I made the best decision of my life. I chose compassion over indifference, love over loneliness, and I have never regretted it for a single day. Grace, you have been my partner, my friend, my love, and my greatest blessing. Here is to 40 more years, if God grants them, and to the family we have built together. Grace's eyes filled with tears as everyone raised their glasses. Later, when the celebration had ended and they were alone again on their porch, she said, "We will not get 40 more years. We are too old for that. Then we will take whatever time we have and make it count," Preston replied. "Just like we always have." And they did. Preston and Grace Boyd lived well into their 80s, surrounded by family and held in respect by everyone who knew them. When Preston finally passed peacefully in his sleep in 1947, Grace followed him 6 months later, unable to bear being without her partner. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a cottonwood tree Preston had planted the year Thomas was born. Their story lived on, though, told and retold, a reminder that love and compassion could triumph over judgment and hate, that second chances were possible, and that sometimes the greatest blessings came from the most unlikely places. The lonely rancher and the condemned woman had found each other in the wild west of Nevada and built a legacy that would endure long after the mines had closed and the boom towns had faded to dust. Their great-grandchildren still worked the Boyd Ranch, still raised and trained horses, still treated people with the same dignity and compassion Preston had shown Grace that day in Rhyolite. And on summer evenings when the light was just right, some said you could still see two figures sitting on the old porch, holding hands and watching the sunset, together for all eternity in the place they had made their home.